The gravel was still warm under my bare feet when my aunt came around the corner of the hog barn and stopped walking like she'd hit a wall. I remember the smell first, diesel and clover, because that's the smell I have never been able to separate from what happened next. I was 22 years old, standing behind the machine shed with a boy who was not from our colony, not from any colony, a boy in suspenders and a straw hat who had ridden 11 miles on a borrowed bicycle to bring me a jar of chokecherry jelly his mother had canned. My aunt looked at him. She looked at me. She said one word, my name, and it did not sound like my name anymore. It sounded like a verdict. I did not know yet that by the time I walked back into the kitchen for supper, 2 phone calls would already have been made, and neither of them would be to me. I had been baptized into that colony at 19. I had milked cows before school for 13 years. I had buried a baby brother at 11 days old and stood dry-eyed at the grave because that is what was expected. I had sewn every stitch of clothing on my body since I was 7, had never once worn a color brighter than what the ministers permitted, had memorized the German catechism word for word before I understood half of what it meant, had obeyed my father, my mother, my boss, my minister, and my own conscience, in that order, for 22 years. And in the space of maybe 90 seconds behind a hog barn, all of that stopped mattering. That was the part one could not make sense of for a very long time. Not the boy. The speed. My name is Katrina. I grew up in a Hutterite colony on the prairie, in a community of maybe 110 people who ate every meal together, shared every dollar, and called each other brother and sister whether we liked one another or not. I am 58 years old now, and I have spent the last several years talking, finally, about the things we were taught never to say out loud. This is one of those places, this channel, where women who grew up plain, Amish, Mennonite, Hutterite, all three, come and tell the truth about what those systems cost us, not to tear the communities down, but because somebody has to say it plainly, and for a long time nobody did. Before I go further, I want to ask you something, and I mean it, I read every comment. Had you ever heard the term degrees of separation used the way we used it, not about acquaintance, but about how far a person's blood and belief had to sit from your own before a marriage was even thinkable? If you'd heard that phrase before this video, tell me where. And if this is the first time, subscribe, because I'm building something here piece by piece, colony by district by conference, and I want you walking through it with me. I need to explain how the rule actually worked, because from the outside it looks like simple prejudice, and it was not simple at all. First, courtship inside a Hutterite colony was never private. A young man's interest in a young woman went through the boss and the minister before it went anywhere near the girl's own feelings, because feelings were considered unreliable and community stability was not. Second, marriage outside the colony system, to an outsider, to what we called English, or even to a member of a different plain tradition entirely, was treated as a form of leaving, not loving, because it threatened the shared property structure the whole colony depended on. Third, any contact with an outsider suitor was to be reported, not by the girl herself, but by whoever witnessed it, aunt, cousin, neighbor, it did not matter, reporting was itself an act of faithfulness. Among the Amish, the same instinct existed but wore different clothes. Courtship crossed the more conservative and less conservative districts sometimes, buggy to buggy, but never crossed traditions, and a stricter district could shun a young man simply for driving through the wrong church district's territory too many Sunday nights in a row. Among Mennonites, especially by my mother's generation, the rule had softened by half in the looser conferences. Marrying outside the faith was frowned on but rarely punished with anything like formal discipline. Of the three, ours was the tightest weave, because we had no private property to loosen the knot. A colony cannot survive a member's heart going somewhere the shared purse cannot follow. Now I need to tell you the part one have never told anyone until this video. His name was Levi. He was Amish, from a district 4 counties over, and I met him at a farm auction where our two worlds happened to overlap for one afternoon, colony wagons and Amish buggies parked in the same dusty field. We did not speak more than 10 sentences that day. But he found out, through a hired English driver who ran produce between our communities, which colony I belonged to, and over the better part of a year he found ways to be where I was, always with some excuse, a delivery, a load of lumber, a jar of jelly. I want to be precise about this because precision is the only thing that makes any of it believable now. We spoke, in total, across 11 months, for something under 4 hours. We were never alone together for longer than the length of time it takes to walk from a barn to a fence line and back. That was the entire romance. 4 hours. 11 months. A fence line. Stay with me, because what happened next is the part that took me 20 years to find words for. My aunt saw us behind the machine shed on a Tuesday in July, and by Tuesday evening my father and our boss were sitting across the kitchen table from me with the lamp turned up too bright, the way it always was when something serious needed saying. I remember the oilcloth on the table had a tear near the edge shaped like a fishhook, and I stared at it the whole time because I could not look at either of their faces. My father did not raise his voice. That is important, because if he had raised his voice I think I could have argued back. Instead he asked me one question. He asked how long. I said 11 months, and I watched my own honesty land on him like a physical weight. Because 11 months meant this had not been an accident, it had been a choice, repeated. What happened over the following 6 days I can recall almost minute by minute. On the first day, our boss called Levi's Amish bishop directly, a courtesy between communities that exists specifically for situations like this, a shared understanding across plain traditions that a wandering young person is everyone's business. On the second day, I was told I would no longer be permitted to help run the noon meal, the task I had done since I was 15, because my presence at the communal table had become, in the minister's words, a distraction to the unity of the group. On the third day, my mother stopped speaking to me except to give instructions, for words at a time, pass the bucket, mind the baby, nothing more. On the fourth day, I learned that Levi had been visited by 2 ministers from his own district and had been told, plainly, that continued contact would result in the ban, their word for it, not so different from ours. On the 5th day, I tried to write him a letter, 1 page, folded twice, and I gave it to the same English driver who had once carried his jelly to me. I never found out if it reached him. On the 6th day, I was called before the full ministers' meeting for the first time in my life, not as a bystander, but as the subject. I want to tell you what I did in the hour after that meeting, because that's the part that changed everything. I walked out past the pig barn to the exact spot where Levi and I had stood, and I sat down in the dirt in my church dress, and I did not cry. I want to be honest. I did not cry once that whole week. I sat there and I counted the fence posts running out toward the road, because counting was the only thing that felt like mine. 51 posts. I remember that number the way some people remember a birthday. The ministers had told me that my behavior had been a betrayal not of any single person, but of the whole colony's unity, Gemeinschaft, the shared life we all depended on, and that continuing it would mean the ban, separation from the table, from the work, eventually from the community itself. I said I understood. That was all I said, 3 words, I understood, and I meant it, and I hated myself for meaning it. I want to say clearly that our boss was not a cruel man. He had raised 11 children of his own inside that colony, had buried 2 of them, had spent 40 years making sure 110 people had food and roofs and work in a system that, whatever else it was, had never once let anyone starve. He was not enforcing the rule because he enjoyed my suffering. He was enforcing it because he believed, genuinely, that the survival of everyone depended on nobody's individual wanting being allowed to outweigh the group's need. That is the part that took me decades to separate out. The system was cruel. The man administering it believed, with his whole chest, that he was being loving. It was not until years later, after I had left, married an outsider, and was sitting in a small counselor's office in a town I'd never heard of at 22, that a woman named Diane, gray-haired, patient, said something that rearranged how I understood my own life. She said, "Katrina, what you're describing isn't a story about a boy you weren't allowed to marry. It's a story about never once being asked what you wanted, by anyone, for 22 years, and then being punished for the one time you tried to answer that question yourself." I have carried that sentence with me since. It was the first time anyone had used the word wanted about me, as though wanting was a legitimate thing a person like me was allowed to do. I used to think this story was about Levi. I don't think that anymore. It took me years to understand what it actually cost me, and let me tell you plainly, it was not the loss of one boy on a bicycle. It was not the loss of a single summer. It was the loss of ever believing my own judgment mattered inside that community, and once that belief is gone, everything after it gets built on sand. The aftermath was quiet, the way these things almost always are. I was not formally banned, not that time, because I agreed to stop, and agreement, even coerced agreement, was enough to satisfy the ministers. But something shifted permanently in how my family looked at me. My mother and I did not have an honest conversation again for 9 years. Letters I wrote after I eventually left the colony entirely, 2 years later, for reasons that had little to do with Levi and everything to do with what that week taught me, went unanswered, or came back unopened, the flap still sealed, my own handwriting staring back at me from the front of the envelope. My father attended my wedding to the man I eventually married, an outsider, an Englishman, standing at the back of a small rented hall, and he left before the meal was served. I have 2 children who have never met their Hutterite grandmother. That is the actual cost. Not a romance interrupted. A lineage severed, quietly, over the space of 1 week, with nobody ever raising their voice. If you grew up somewhere that taught you your own wanting was dangerous, I am talking to you right now, not just to the plain kids, though especially to you. If you were taught that being reported on by your own family was a form of love, if you learned to measure your worth by how well you complied rather than by who you actually were, I see you, and I want you to hear this clearly. What happened to you was not because you were too much. It was because the system needed you to be less. Those are different things, and you deserve to know the difference. I've come to think of this whole channel as a kind of map I'm drawing one story at a time, because the wound is not the same in every tradition, even when the shape looks similar from far away. In a stricter Amish district, my story might have ended in a formal shunning within days. No 6-day grace period at all. Among the more relaxed Mennonite conferences my mother came from, a boy like Levi might simply have been invited to join the fellowship, courtship followed by conversion, no colony boss, no ministers meeting, barely a ripple. Hours sat in between, tight enough to end things in a week, loose enough to leave me standing, technically, still inside the fence when it was over. I want you to see all 3 shapes eventually, because none of them alone tells you the whole truth of what plain life asks of its daughters. What happened to Levi, what I learned decades later about the life he ended up living, and what actually happened the night I finally left the colony for good. 2 years after that week by the hog barn, I have not been able to fit into a single video. I've written the fuller account down, the whole year that followed, in something I'm calling 51 fence posts, and I'll leave where to find it in the pinned comment below, along with the next story in this series, which comes from a Mennonite woman whose family handled almost the identical situation in a completely different way. Read it if you want the rest. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. Wherever you came from, whatever fence you were told not to cross, you were not the problem. Until next time, this is where we say it plainly, together.